You're listening to episode 6 of the Confident Writer podcast with Jane Pike. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Confident Writer podcast. Today I wanted to talk about a mood state that visits many of us, and that is anxiety. This is a favourite topic of mine because there is a surprising lack of understanding as to why anxiety might arise in the first place, but also how to practically deal with it when it does come up. I'm a member of a number of online groups, just like many of us, and from time to time I see questions pop up about how to deal with anxiety in different writing situations or competitive situations, and the comments always make me smile. They usually range from suggesting a number of legal or illegal drugs. Wine commonly features, but also there's the unhelpful suggestions such as you'll be fine, or don't worry about it, or don't focus on anxiety, which when you are actually in the midst of experiencing that kind of reaction is just super unhelpful, but also makes you feel kind of bad on top of a situation that's already really unpleasant to deal with. This is such a comprehensive topic that we are going to be touching on over a number of episodes. But today I thought we could zoom in on the anatomy of anxiety so you can better understand the two different pathways that cause anxiety to arise and find a solution that best suits you. I have had a lot of personal experience with anxiety. Up until I really developed the skills that I teach now, anxiety was definitely my modus operandi. It was my default response. And that's a really common situation for any of us who are practiced at experiencing anxiety. The reason for that is that neurons that fire together wire together. That means the more you think a specific thought, the easier it is to return to that thought. So worry breeds worry. Rumination breeds rumination, because essentially every time we are thinking those thoughts, we're breeding other little thought families that get stronger and stronger in our mind and become easier for us to return to in the moments where we might feel a little bit compromised. What commonly happens is that we get caught up in a thought loop. Instead of assessing a situation and then taking constructive action in one direction or another, we ruminate and worry and fall into this endless cycle of self-doubt that feeds on itself. This is a really common feature of anticipation anxiety. But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's look at the two different ways that anxiety comes up. The names that I give these pathways are the thought pathway and the feeling pathway, and really understanding how they apply to you is imperative in finding an effective solution. The thought pathway, it comes about through conscious activation. So that's us essentially focusing on future-based thoughts that usually have the worst case scenario in mind. The feeling pathway, in contrast, is one that comes about through environmental or emotional triggers or memories. So that's a really common one to feature when we've had an injury or some kind of trauma, where we don't actually have to consciously think about the thoughts, but something in our environment or something in our memory causes us to go into an anxiety reaction, even if we haven't had a thought process that we're aware of prior to actually experiencing the physical response. Let's break it down. In any situation that we find ourselves in, we are gathering information from our environment through our senses. All of this information comes in and it is sent to the part of our brain called the thalamus. And the thalamus I think of like a road traffic controller. It's taking in all the information and sending it to the different parts of the brain required to process it and use it to best effect. So the information comes in and then it gets sent to the cortex. And generally speaking, the cortex receives all of the information and puts it together in a neat little package so we can decide what it is we want to do about it. The cortex is really what allows us to experience an integrated view of the world. But the key thing to understand about the cortex is it is responsible for anticipation and interpretation. That means it helps us plan ahead. So we receive all of this information from the thalamus, it comes into the cortex, and one of the functions of the cortex is to decide what that information means for us. This is actually one of our powers that separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. That ability to take in information and project into the future an imagined version of a variety of different scenarios and what that might mean to us in any given moment. You can see then how this works to our advantage when we are using this to best effect, and to our disadvantage if we've got into the habit of being concerned about the future or being negatively geared in our focus. The cortex then helps us plan ahead, just to recap. It helps us initiate responses, and it's also what's responsible for allowing us to stop or change or modify a behaviour that's not working for us. When we are in the midst of cortex-based anxiety, we receive information and we project into the future, but that projection is not positive. And instead of actually making an assessment about what this situation means and moving forward with constructive purpose, we get stuck on a feedback loop. We get stuck on a tape, and we look at the different scenarios that are available for us. None of them feel appealing. Usually they are always focused on something going wrong or something that we want to avoid. And as a consequence of that, we send information to the amygdala, which fires off the anxiety response. Where we often experience a disconnect is in the understanding of how our thoughts go on to create the physical experience of anxiety. So I thought we could do a little practical experiment now, which involves a piece of fruit and me talking you through an imagined process. For the moment, I would like you to pretend that on the palm of my hand, I am holding an orange. You can see the orange. It's one of those perfect oranges where the outside of the skin is smooth. It has those slight dimples in the actual texture of it. But this particular orange is an organic one, and I've just picked it off the tree. It's still got the stalk attached. There's still the leaves there, these beautiful glossy green leaves. And you can see it sitting in the palm of my hand. Feels a little bit heavy. It's got that lovely weight to it. And what I'm going to do is just take a knife and I'm going to slice through the center of the orange. And the two halves are going to fall apart into my hand so that you can see the inside of the orange. A little bit of juice now actually has just dripped down onto my hand. And there's that beautiful glistening texture to the inside of the orange. If you were to take a big deep breath in now, you can smell that glorious citrusy smell. It smells really sweet and fresh and tangy. And what I'm going to do is just cut one of these halves in half again so it's in quarters and peel the outside off. And now I'm going to hand you this segment of orange, and you're going to pop it into your mouth and just bite down on it. And as you bite down, you get that glorious sensation of the juiciness of the orange. You can taste that beautiful orange taste. And as you swallow the orange, you get this feeling of freshness. Okay, and now you can come back to focusing on what it is that we're talking about. Chances are, if you went through that exercise with me and played along, you will have some saliva in your mouth. You will have really clearly been able to see the orange sitting on my hand and been able to see further when I cut the orange and what the inside of the orange might have looked like. You can smell the orange. Basically, everything that I described in a sensory capacity, you were able to hook into. And on a physical level, with that experience of the saliva coming into your mouth, with you being able to taste that orange taste, you are actually having a physical experience of eating that orange, even though on a conscious level, you know there is no orange and I am not physically anywhere near you. This is how we create a thought process which leads to a physical response. Our unconscious mind receives all of its information by means of the sensory system. And when we give it enough detail, when we can describe what something looks like, what it feels like, what it tastes like, what it smells like, our unconscious mind cannot differentiate between what is real and what is imagined. And so it prepares on a physical level for us to start to eat that orange. If we were to transpose this example to the experience of anxiety, we can then start to understand how some of our thoughts create the physical experience of anxiety, even in situations where we're very far removed from what it is that's actually concerning us. For example, you might be concerned about riding your horse for whatever reason is relevant to you. It might be that you're going through some behavioural challenges with them at the moment. It might be that you are actually in the midst of up-leveling a certain movement that you're practicing and you're concerned that you're not actually going to be able to pull that off. And when you think about that, even washing up the dishes or making the bed, you experience all of the feelings of anxiety physically as if you were actually going through that in the moment. The reason for this is, just as in the orange example, you have created a mental movie in your mind's eye that gives your unconscious mind enough information to believe that that's real. And on a physical level, you've created all of the responses that activate your nervous system, that send your adrenal system into activation, that send all of the hormones necessary out there to actually launch you into that anxiety response. Following along this line, you can see then just how important it is to manage our focus. Just as we can create anxiety by focusing on the things we don't want to happen, we're equally capable of creating the feelings associated to confidence and calm by focusing on what we do want to happen. So if you're experiencing anxiety as a result of your thoughts, then your solution needs to be thought-based also. I'm not suggesting this is easy, but it's totally possible and it takes some practice. But you need to arm yourselves with the mental skills to be able to sharpen your focus and channel it in a constructive direction. And often this starts well away from the horse. Knowing that you can create the physical experience of anxiety just by thinking about it means you can deal with them as soon as you become mindful of them. The seed of the anxiety arises not necessarily in the moment that you're concerned about. What I mean by that is you have a chance to implement a solution and to start to practice pathways in your mind that cultivate confidence and calm well away from your horse. The seed of the anxiety begins with the thought, not with the physical experience of the anxiety or even being in a situation that might necessarily give rise to your anxiety. The thought is what creates it. It does not necessarily need to be valid in the moment, and you can be well removed from the physical experience that might actually be causing you concern in the first place. The other thing to remember is that the cortex is what's responsible for your perception. It's how we attach meaning to a specific situation. That means that the story we tell ourselves and the context that we're viewing the situation from has a direct link to how we feel about it. Attaching an empowering meaning to whatever situation comes up is vital in being able to not only direct your feelings of anxiety to a more constructive place, but be able to implement feelings of confidence and calm that will allow you to move in the direction that you want, rather than staying focused on what it is that you're trying to avoid. That's the thought pathway. The feeling pathway is the name that I give to anxiety that arises as a consequence of environmental triggers and emotional memories. In, quote, a normal situation where there's no perceived threat that we pick up from our environment. And what I mean by threat is any environmental or emotional situation that our brain and neurology has stored as being problematic for us. The information is sent through to our cortex, this thought pathway that we just described, and that is what is responsible for our higher reasoning and thought. So from that place, we make projections about the future and we decide the best course of action. In the case of the feeling pathway, however, we unconsciously recognize a trigger that we've stored in our mental hard drive as problematic. And what I mean by problematic, that can be in both a physical or an emotional sense and does not have to make sense to us on a logical level. When we pick up any of those triggers, And this is really common in situations where we've experienced some kind of trauma or we're returning from injury, for example. So if you've fallen off and physically hurt yourself, or you've been in a situation, perhaps competitively or otherwise, where you've experienced embarrassment or humiliation. Those are really good examples. That conscious thought process is overridden. So we bypass the cortex, which is responsible for us making a logical assessment about what it is we're being presented with and deciding the best course of action forward. And we go straight to the experience of anxiety. When you find yourself in the midst of an anxiety reaction that is motivated by the amygdala, then it will happen before you've even had a chance to think about it, because the reality is that you haven't. What this does is allows us to protect ourselves or to remove ourselves from a potentially dangerous situation prior to us needing to have a conversation or a conscious thought process about it. It is not something that we want to get rid of. This is the pathway that allows us to get out of the way of a moving car before we've even thought about it, or protect ourselves or remove ourselves or someone else from danger. However, the problematic side of this pathway is that we can develop illogical anchors to emotional or environmental triggers that cause us to feel anxious, even if that response serves no protective function. Some clues that you might be in the middle of a feeling-based pathway anxiety response is saying things like, I just don't know why I feel anxious, there's no logical basis to this, or feeling like you're actually able to competently do what you want to do with your horse, but you can't stop yourself from feeling the anxiety that you feel. Commonly, the two pathways start to interlink as well. So if you have experienced some kind of injury or you have become practiced at the anxiety response, you start to anticipate the anxiety and be concerned about being concerned, or feel anxious about being anxious. For that reason, whenever I'm working with riders who are in the midst of an anxiety crisis or are experiencing anxiety as a common feature in their riding, we want to deal with both of these pathways at the same time, because we need to create some new associations to the environmental or emotional triggers that are setting off this amygdala-based reaction. And at the same time, we need to get a handle on these anticipatory thoughts that are causing them to focus on the worst case scenario and having the physical experience of anxiety as a response to that. If you identify with this form of anxiety, if your hand is in the air and you're like, that's me, I just get anxiety out of the blue, the key is to retrain your brain to create new associations to the things that are concerning you. In other words, in order to get over the anxiety, drum roll please, you have to put yourself in situations that set it off. And I know that can seem like a lot to deal with in the moment, but we need to do some legwork prior to that to make sure that you're not throwing yourself in the deep end. That involves giving yourself some tools to be able to deal with it effectively and safely, as well as dealing with any processing that needs to happen or related trauma to make sure that we're really incrementally exposing ourselves to the anxiety-producing situation and can retrain that association in a way that is sustainable and keeps you out of overwhelm. As a final note, if you're finding yourself in a riding or horsing situation currently where anxiety is a big thing for you, please don't lose hope. I know that it really feels consuming and it feels like it's insurmountable at times, but it does not need to be a permanent feature in your riding life. There are so many effective tools and techniques that can really allow you to effectively manage and process these feelings. And yes, it takes a bit of effort and practice on your part, but I'm absolutely here to support you in that process. Investing in and understanding these skills does absolutely give you the ability to manage the thought patterns that aren't serving you. And then you can start to really program any negative associations that are currently getting in the way of you getting out there and doing what you love with your horse. If you do want to dive in, if you want to get into this into more detail with me, check out my membership program, because the calm pathway in there deals specifically with what it is we've been talking about today and gives you all of the tools that I've mentioned to really get you to the other side of anxiety. So please check that out. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am so grateful for you taking the time. I'm loving hanging out with you in these episodes, and I'm looking forward to talking with you in the next session together. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share the love. A review would be amazing and so appreciated. You can also screenshot this and share it on social media. You'll find me in all the usual places online. Facebook at The Confident Writer, Instagram confident_writer, and on YouTube Confident Writer. Thank you so much and looking forward to chatting again with you soon.